The CNN studio buzzed with quiet anticipation. Overhead lights blazed like tiny suns pouring heat down on the sleek glass table at the center of the room. Cameras glided silently on metal rails, their red tally lights glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere in the background, producers whispered rapid-fire instructions into headsets, their voices hushed but urgent. Papers rustled, a cough echoed faintly. You could feel it in the air, something big was about to happen. Then Jasmine Crockett stepped into the frame. Her cobalt blue blazer caught the light perfectly, giving her presence an electric edge. A gold statement necklace rested against her collarbone, subtle but bold just like her. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with silent determination. Every step she took was measured, controlled, yet her heartbeat pounded like distant thunder. Across the table sat Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard law legend. At 85 years old, his name carried decades of legal authority, victories, and influence. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, an air of confidence radiating from him. His polished navy suit and carefully combed silver hair gave him an almost untouchable aura. The cameras focused. The microphones clicked on, and somewhere deep inside, everyone watching, both in the studio and across America, knew this wasn't going to be just another CNN debate. Anderson Cooper leaned slightly forward, his silver hair catching the studio lights, the reflection in his glasses sharp and deliberate. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone designed to reassure viewers at home that tonight's discussion would be controlled and professional. Good evening. Tonight we'll be discussing executive privilege, the scope of presidential power, and where the boundaries should be drawn. The words hung in the air like harmless notes on a page. Executive privilege, constitutional limits, checks and balances. For the audience watching at home, it sounded like another dry academic debate. Something for the law students, the policy, wonks, the political junkies who cared about footnotes and obscure Supreme Court precedents. Even inside the studio, some of the junior producers relaxed in their chairs, thinking this was going to be just another predictable CNN panel, but they were wrong. So very wrong, because within minutes, what began as a polite discussion would erupt into a confrontation, one that would shake Alan Dershowitz's reputation and launch Jasmine Crockett into the national spotlight. Alan Dershowitz leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting casually on the armrest, the other gesturing in a way that carried both authority and dismissal. His voice was smooth, almost polite, but his words cut like a razor. Well, he began with a faint smile. I respect Congresswoman Crockett's enthusiasm, but it's clear she's still new to this game. Experience matters, and so does a proper understanding of the Constitution. The studio murmured softly. It wasn't an outright insult, but everyone heard the condescension buried beneath the carefully chosen words. A few members of the audience exchanged knowing looks. Some even smiled faintly, sensing what Dershowitz thought would be his first easy victory. But then the camera cut to Jasmine Crockett. She didn't blink. Her posture remained calm, poised, almost serene. But her eyes told a different story. There beneath the calm surface, something ignited. A quiet fire, a sharp defiance. It was the kind of look that said, "Not tonight, not me." And in that instant, without a single word spoken, the balance of the room shifted. What Dershowitz thought would be just another easy debate was about to become something much bigger, a battle neither side would ever forget. Alan Dershowitz straightened in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm, then turned his gaze directly toward the camera. His faint smile carried an edge, the kind of confidence that comes from decades of dominance in courtrooms and classrooms. And when he spoke, his tone was deceptively soft, but every word landed like a blade. Congresswoman Crockett, he said smoothly, might want to review her law school notes. The words hung in the air for a split second, and then the reaction came. A soft murmur rolled across the CNN studio, followed by a wave of suppressed chuckles. Some audience members leaned toward one another, exchanging amused glances. A few even smiled openly, as though they had just witnessed a public takedown. For them, it seemed like Dershowitz had scored an effortless win, the Harvard legend putting a freshman congresswoman back in her place. But the cameras caught something the audience missed. They zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett's face. She didn't flinch. She didn't force a smile. She didn't even blink. Instead, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. There was no anger, yet no visible retaliation, just a quiet, steady focus. A storm gathering beneath the surface. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. And for those paying attention, it was clear Dershowitz had just lit a fuse he couldn't put out. Jasmine Crockett didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the glass table, her posture relaxed but deliberate. The camera zoomed in slowly, searching for even the slightest reaction. But there was none. No smile, no frown, not a single blink. To anyone who wasn't paying close attention, she might have seemed unfazed, even passive. But for those watching carefully, something else was happening. Behind her steady composure, a storm was forming. Her jaw tightened just enough for the camera to catch it. Her fingertips pressed slightly into the smooth surface of the table. And then her eyes. The light from the studio reflected off them, revealing a quiet fire. Not reckless rage, but controlled defiance. It was the look of someone who had been underestimated before and had learned exactly how to turn that underestimation into a weapon. Dershowitz didn't see it. The audience didn't see it. But the camera did. It lingered on her face just long enough for viewers across America to feel it the shift. Jasmine Crockett wasn't retreating. She was calculating, and soon everyone in that studio would know it. Anderson Cooper turned to Jasmine Crockett, his voice calm, almost neutral. "Congresswoman, how do you respond?" Crockett inhaled slowly, her hands still resting on the glass table. When she spoke, her tone was measured, quiet, but sharp each word, precise like the strike of a gavel. Professor Dershowitz speaks of executive privilege as though it has no limits. But the Supreme Court was clear in United States versus Nixon. Not even the president is above the law. The name of the case cut through the studio like a bell toll. Some heads in the audience turned. Others leaned forward, sensing a shift. But before she could finish, Dershowitz leaned in, raising a hand. His voice grew louder, sharper, his smile tightening into something closer to a sneer. "Congresswoman, you're conflating separate legal principles." "That case is entirely different," Crockett tried to continue, but Dershowitz cut her off again. Then again. Each interruption carried more bite, more condescension. His tone no longer polite. It was cynical, impatient, dismissive. The air in the studio grew heavy. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The audience murmured. Even Anderson Cooper raised a hand, trying to calm the escalating storm. But it was too late. The tension had thickened into something you could feel in your chest. Every camera zoomed in tighter. Every viewer at home leaned forward. The clash had begun. Jasmine Crockett waited until the studio finally fell quiet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward or interrupt. Instead, she let the silence stretch and then spoke. Her words were steady, unshaken, not the language of someone trading insults, but the testimony of someone who had lived through battles that mattered. "I didn't come from an ivory tower. I came from courtrooms where real lives were at stake." The effect was immediate. The studio froze. The audience stopped murmuring. Even the panelists, who had been shifting uncomfortably moments before, sat completely still. Crockett's voice carried not just authority, but experience. It wasn't theory. It wasn't politics. It was truth. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't playing the game on Dershowitz's terms. She was reminding the nation and him that she had stood beside people who had nothing but the Constitution to protect them. And she had fought for them. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. It was the silence of respect, even from those who weren't ready to admit it yet. Jasmine Crockett didn't stop. Her voice remained calm, but her words carried the weight of steel. In Trump versus Mazars, Chief Justice Roberts himself wrote, "The president is not above the law." And in Marbury v. Madison, the court made it clear, it is the duty of the judiciary to say what the law is. Each citation landed like a hammer against the polished glass table. The cameras caught it perfectly. They zoomed in on Alan Dershowitz, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. His jaw tightened. For the first time that night, the legendary Harvard professor looked unsettled. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something else. Recognition. Recognition that Jasmine Crockett wasn't bluffing. Recognition that she had receipts and she wasn't afraid to use them. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. This wasn't the polished back and forth they expected. This was something raw, a clash of lived experience against academic prestige. For decades, Dershowitz had dominated debates with quick wit and authority. But now, with every name she spoke, every precedent she cited, he was being pushed into a place he rarely stood defense. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She simply reached down, opened her leather portfolio, and pulled out a small black USB drive. The studio lights caught its metallic edge, making it gleam for just a moment. She held it between her fingers like a dagger. Then she looked directly at Alan Dershowitz. Her voice was calm but carried the quiet weight of inevitability. "Let's hear it from your own mouth." The words sliced through the silence. Anderson Cooper's brows furrowed. He glanced at the production team, then gave a quick signal. Within seconds, a technician rushed forward, plugging the USB into the studio system. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz, catching the sudden flicker of unease that flashed across his face. For the first time all night, the professor's legendary composure showed a crack. The audience leaned forward, breathless. Something was about to play on those giant CNN screens. Something no one in that room would ever forget. The giant CNN screens flickered to life. First, a grainy clip from 1998. A younger Alan Dershowitz, his voice firm, his gestures animated as he leaned toward the camera. "Impeachment does not require a statutory crime." The words rang out clear, emphatic. Then the video cut sharply to 2019, a visibly older Dershowitz on Fox News, his tone just as confident, but the message completely reversed. Without a crime, there can be no impeachment. The contrast was devastating. Side by side, the two clips told a story no amount of explanation could erase. Dershowitz in 1998 versus Dershowitz in 2019, two faces, two versions of the truth. The studio fell into absolute silence. No one moved, no one spoke. All that could be heard was the sound of Dershowitz's own voice contradicting itself, echoing across the room. For the first time that night, the Harvard legend wasn't the man delivering the lecture. He was the man on trial. The last echo of Dershowitz's words faded from the speakers. And then nothing. The CNN studio was frozen in silence, a silence so complete it seemed to press down on every chest in the room. The cameras cut to Alan Dershowitz. His legendary composure was gone. His face, once flush with confidence, had turned pale under the unforgiving lights. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. One hand gripped the edge of the table. The other trembled ever so slightly, a tremor the cameras caught in merciless high definition. Then the cameras shifted to Jasmine Crockett. She sat tall, her chin lifted, eyes steady and unflinching. Where Dershowitz looked diminished, Crockett looked ascendant. The contrast was undeniable. In that moment, every viewer at home could see it. The torch had passed. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely. And the silence was louder than any debate ever could be. The silence inside the CNN studio lasted only seconds. But outside, across America, the explosion was immediate. Within minutes, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram lit up like a storm. Legal analysts, political commentators, and everyday viewers flooded their feeds. Clips of Dershowitz contradicting himself spread at lightning speed. By the 15-minute mark, one phrase had already taken over the internet. Chad Crockett Clapback. It was everywhere. On news feeds, on trending bars, on late-night group chats. A constitutional law professor from Georgetown tweeted, "This is no longer just a debate. This is a masterclass in preparation meeting arrogance." A civil rights attorney wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded America that lived experience matters as much as academic theory." Even journalists who rarely praise politicians admitted live on their own feeds that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The clip of Crockett sliding the USB across the table played millions of times within the hour. The split-screen video of Dershowitz 1998 versus 2019 became the meme of the night. And all across the nation, people weren't just watching. They were choosing sides. By the next morning, the confrontation had become a media firestorm. MSNBC opened its primetime segment with bold words splashed across the screen, "A masterclass in receipts over reputation." Rachel Maddow leaned into the camera, her tone sharp and deliberate. This wasn't just a debate. This was a turning point where preparation, evidence, and consistency defeated decades of status and reputation. Across the aisle, Fox News tried a different approach. They aired the debate but carefully avoided showing the USB video. Instead, they framed it as a heated exchange between a seasoned professor and a young congresswoman. But it didn't matter because the internet was already saturated with the clip. Within hours, the split-screen video of Dershowitz 1998 versus 2019 had been shared millions of times. It played on smartphones, in diners and office break rooms, and in college classrooms. The harder Fox News tried to downplay it, the more obvious it became. They couldn't stop it. The story had escaped their control. It belonged to the people now. In the weeks that followed, the CNN showdown moved beyond cable news and social media. It found its way into the lecture halls of America. At Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, and state universities alike, constitutional law professors pulled up the clip as a teaching tool. The split-screen video of Dershowitz's contradictions wasn't just trending online anymore. It was on classroom projectors. Professors told their students, "This is what happens when consistency falters. Reputation can't save you if the receipts are there." Casebooks were updated, law school discussions turned fiery, and in those rooms, Jasmine Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a case study, a living example of how preparation, evidence, and principle can dismantle even the most established voices. Across the country, young law students, especially women and students of color, saw themselves reflected in her. They watched how she held her ground against condescension and arrogance, and they realized if she can stand there and win, maybe I can too. What began as a single night on CNN was now shaping the way future lawyers thought about truth, integrity, and courage. Weeks after the CNN confrontation, Jasmine Crockett returned to her district for a town hall meeting. The room was packed. Teachers, retirees, activists, and young students filled every seat. During the Q&A, a young black law student stood up. Her voice shook. Her hands trembled as she clutched the microphone. And then, to everyone's surprise, tears streamed down her cheeks. Through sobs, she managed to say, "Watching you showed me that my voice matters, even when powerful men try to silence it." The room went silent, not with tension, but with shared emotion. Crockett stepped forward, her own eyes glistening. She reached out, embracing the young woman in front of the entire town hall. In that instant, the battle on CNN was no longer just about constitutional law or political reputations. It was about something far bigger. It was about proving to a new generation that their voices belong in classrooms, in courtrooms, and in Congress. For Jasmine Crockett, that moment meant more than every headline, every trending hashtag, every clip replayed on cable news. Because this was no longer just politics. This was legacy. For decades, Alan Dershowitz had been untouchable. He was the name professors cited in lectures, the guest networks brought in when they needed authority, the man whose words could still make headlines. But after CNN, that aura was gone. His reputation, once ironclad, was now cracked wide open. Everywhere he went, every panel he joined, every interview he gave, one question always came back. "Professor, how do you explain the contradiction between what you said in 1998 and what you said in 2019? It didn't matter what the topic was. Criminal justice, civil liberties, presidential powers." The shadow of that split-screen video followed him like a ghost. He tried to explain. He tried to contextualize. But the more he spoke, the deeper the wound became. What had once been a legacy of brilliance now sounded to many like the excuses of a man trying to rewrite his own history. In law schools, his quotes were no longer studied only for insight. They were dissected as examples of inconsistency. For the first time in his storied career, Alan Dershowitz wasn't shaping the narrative. The narrative was shaping him. While Alan Dershowitz's reputation faltered, Jasmine Crockett's star only grew brighter. Within weeks, she was invited to speak at national symposiums and law conferences. Panels that once would have overlooked a first-term congresswoman now placed her center stage. Her name appeared on invitations alongside Supreme Court justices, civil rights icons, and constitutional scholars. And when she spoke, she commanded the room. She became a voice not just for her district in Texas, but for a larger principle: justice, transparency, consistency. Cable networks sought her out for interviews. Law schools invited her to guest lecture. Editorial boards quoted her as a rising standard for principled politics. What had begun as a fiery confrontation on CNN had transformed her into something far greater, a national figure who could not be dismissed, condescended to, or ignored. Jasmine Crockett was no longer the newcomer. She was the benchmark. In the end, the CNN showdown was never just about Alan Dershowitz and Jasmine Crockett. It was about something larger, something every American watching could feel deep in their chest. It was the reminder that justice does not belong to the loudest voice, nor to the most powerful reputation. Justice belongs to those who come armed with truth and principle. Dershowitz had prestige, decades of scholarship, and the weight of Harvard behind him. Crockett had preparation, consistency, and lived experience. And on that night, it was clear which carried more power. The clip became more than viral content. It became a parable replayed in classrooms, debated in law journals, and remembered by millions of viewers as the night a young congresswoman showed that truth can still humble power. For America, the lesson was simple but profound. In a democracy, justice is never owned. It is earned every single day by those who dare to defend it. At the end of it all, the clash between Alan Dershowitz and Jasmine Crockett was not just a televised debate. It was a mirror reflecting what happens when the law is bent for politics and when principle is sacrificed for power. When the law twists, public trust collapses. And when public trust collapses, democracy itself trembles. Jasmine Crockett knew this. That's why, in her closing words, she didn't just address Dershowitz. She spoke to the entire nation. The Constitution belongs to all of us. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a reminder. A declaration that the law is not the property of professors, politicians, or pundits. It is the shared shield of every citizen, the worker, the teacher, the nurse, the student. And on that night, millions were reminded that justice is not about who shouts the loudest, but about who stands firm on consistency and truth. What Jasmine Crockett proved that night went far beyond one debate. She showed America that power does not guarantee victory. Prestige does not guarantee truth. And arrogance will always fall against someone who comes armed with facts, receipts, and preparation. Dershowitz had decades of scholarship, the aura of Harvard, and the reputation of a legal titan. But Crockett had something more dangerous. She came ready. Every case, every precedent, every contradiction laid out with precision. And with that, she did what few thought possible. She forced one of the most powerful legal voices in America to lower his head. Her victory wasn't about shouting louder. It wasn't about clever sound bites. It was about the power of being prepared, the simple, undeniable truth that when evidence meets arrogance, evidence wins. In the end, this story was never just about Jasmine Crockett and Alan Dershowitz. It was about America. It was about what happens when truth collides with arrogance, when preparation meets power. And above all, it was a reminder etched into the memory of millions. Reputation fades. Receipts last forever. Dershowitz brought a legacy. Crockett brought the evidence. And on that night, evidence won. The story of Jasmine Crockett versus Alan Dershowitz reminds us of something vital. Preparation and truth are more powerful than titles and reputations. In life, you will face people who seem bigger, stronger, or untouchable because of their status. But never forget, status fades. What lasts is your consistency, your integrity, and your courage to stand firm when it matters most. So prepare yourself. Stand by your principles. And when the moment comes, let the truth speak for you. If this story moved you, if you believe in justice, truth, and the power of standing firm, then don't just stop here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and join our community where we bring you the most powerful stories that reveal the truth behind power. Because together we can make sure the voices of truth are never silenced.